regular basis doing this exercise and also on some other projects here at the law school. Dr. Bob Phillips is an elder, and elder doesn't just mean an old person. Elder is a term that we use in our communities when someone has accumulated a certain amount of wisdom and teachings and knowledge about Indigenous legal traditions, and it's a very special role.
Nancy, Sego, Wajed, Bonjour. I've just said hello to everyone in probably 4 or 5 of the different native languages that you can hear spoken on the streets of Toronto here today. And I am very, very fortunate because I am able to give back to the community by especially telling non-native people about what happened to native people and why that's important. As long as it's hidden and as long as what happened legally here in Canada is hidden, then no progress can be made. There can be no reconciliation.
In an era where reconciliation is the ambition, that I think has to begin with better understanding and knowledge and empathy. And I think that the blanket exercise contributed on all those fronts.
So the blanket exercise is going to ask you to play the role of Indigenous people on Turtle Island, which is what we call North America. And our narrators are going to explain the history from first contact until present day.
It was just so well organized and thoughtful in the way that it was put together, and I was just blown away by the experience.
I felt a weight on me physically, the weight of all that history.
Now, smudging is one of those things that we usually do when we start a meeting of some kind.
I think it's important, given that this is our shared history, to really understand the full scope and extent of the shared history. I think it's really important to also to get that information in a way that's more than just from a book or more than just from like a PowerPoint slide from a professor. I think actually like experiencing it and walking through it is so powerful.
And so, once again, now I'm going to smudge. Normally I would do this very quietly, but since this is an instructional thing, I'm going to talk. And I bring some of the smoke to my forehead so that I have a good mind, a clear mind.
One of the key ways that knowledge is passed on in Indigenous communities is through ceremony. And this isn't a ceremony in the strict traditional sense of things, but it is a ceremony in other ways. We engage in ceremony in the beginning, we smudge, we have a talking circle or some form of sharing circle at the end, and we all get together and engage in a physical exercise.
You can take off your shoes. Usually the smudge smell covers the foot sting.
So I think that learning through this form of ceremony is very important and is fundamentally different than learning in a more traditional academic setting.
So now you can stand up, and if you have a scroll, bring it with you.
There's an air in the room when you start doing it. There's this air of intensity around it, a little bit like nervousness, but then once the script starts reading and you start moving around the blanket, you kind of just get lost in the experience of hearing the story being told to you and trying to, I think, square with your own preconceptions of what actually the experience was and what actually had happened.
I can say as an Indigenous person, growing up in my traditions, that I still learn something going through the blanket exercise. And a part of that is because knowledge is what's created in the relationships between us. So when you go to the blanket exercise and have the opportunity to speak and experience issues that maybe you've been informed about before, there are different issues through that experience.
It's an incredible community building process. So to do this with students and staff members and faculty and administrators, there is this sort of unifying experience that regardless of where you started from before you took your shoes off and stepped on the blankets, there is something that kind of joins us all.
What I found particularly powerful about the blanket exercise was that it was not a simple kind of recitation of facts. The blankets, contracted over time, and the space was contracted. Divisions were created. That metaphor was incredibly powerful in conveying a kind of visceral sense of what some of these facts meant.
It felt as if I was reliving my own history. Coming from Jamaica, where we had slavery and colonization, and we're still experiencing the remnants of that. Actually going through that process where we were taking off the blanket, it felt that way to me. It resonated with me.
And so the land disappearing out from under you as the cumulative effect of all of these multiple tragedies and wrongs that were committed against the First Peoples was just incredibly powerful as a way of understanding it.
Unless we change the general attitudes towards Native people, nothing is going to change. And really, it's the laws that have caused residential school systems and 60 scoop and all of those things.
It's not easy to hear this stuff, but it's really important. And the point of doing it is not to make everyone feel guilty and terrible and to you go home and carry that with you. The point is that we all need to know this so that it can affect our behavior in the future.
The most important thing is that all of our lives are more meaningful when we understand each other and when we respect each other. And this exercise gives people the grounding that they need to begin to understand what questions to ask to learn more about Indigenous people and Indigenous people's lives.
Of all the hour and a half that I've spent in the last 2 or 3 months, it's the one that's going to have one of the longest lasting impressions on me. So I'm very glad to have done it, and I highly recommend it.
This exercise is meaningful for us and transformative for us, but it requires you. And I think that taking up that call and that invitation is a responsibility of all of us. And no, you don't need to know anything before you go into it. And what you do know will probably change.
Each community had its own language, culture, tradition, laws, and government. This is going to be a great movie.